This is Professor Russell James at Texas Tech University, and today we're going to take a look at the upcoming market outlook for planned giving and charitable financial planning. This is demographic and statistical information that can be particularly important for organizational leaders as they're looking at how is the market going to change, what is ahead, in particular in these two areas. So for nonprofit organizations, the focus is on planned giving. For financial planning or estate planning organizations, the focus is on charitable financial planning and charitable estate planning. So what are some trends we see? What's happening? What's coming up ahead? Well, the number one reality, which is true in a number of different ways, is the truth that the future is bright. There are many, many reasons why this space of charitable estate planning, planned giving, will be substantially increasing in a sustained way for a large number of years. So let's take a look at some of this information. The first thing that's important to keep in mind about charitable estate planning and planned giving is that the most important factor to predict who is interested in leaving a gift to charity in their will or trust document is childlessness. So what we're looking at here is the national trends from the Health and Retirement Study showing the nationally representative share of people who actually include a charitable component in their will or trust, looking only at people who actually have will or trust documents. Okay. Now, if we look at those who have grandchildren, as an example, those who have grandchildren, about 7% of the 55 and above population includes a gift to charity in those will or trust documents. Those who have children only, that goes up to about 11 or 12% are actually including a gift to charity. So there's a big jump here from here to here, but look at the massive difference. If we're looking at married people age 55 and above with no children or grandchildren, half of those people actually include a charitable component in their will or trust document, among those who actually have the will or trust documents, okay? So it's not just that, we get, oh, well, this is, it doubles here and then maybe it triples. No. We're talking about an order of magnitude difference that takes place as we move to those who have no offspring. Now, those who are unmarried with no offspring, about 30% of them include a charitable component in their estate plan. Still a massive, massive indicator. Now, this is showing trends, and you notice these trends are, modestly positive. This is certainly a generally positive trend that we're seeing here. And so that is true. We're seeing generally positive trends, maybe flat in other categories, but that's not the real driver here. The real driver is to simply understand how dramatic of a factor childlessness is in driving people's decisions to actually to include a charitable component in their plans. Now let's combine that with what's happening demographically. This is childlessness rates of people at different age ranges. Okay, so what we're seeing here is the age range of people at different ages and the childlessness rates of that age cohort. Okay, so for example here, we're looking at people who are in the 82 to 86 age range. That group has a childlessness of about 10% of the population. Okay, now this measurement is not taken actually when they're 82 to 86. This comes from census data, and census data is taken at the ages 40 to 44. Okay, so we're pushing that forward because these people were actually included in that census report back in 1976. So people who in 1976 were in this census report showing childlessness at age 40 to 44 are now age 82 to 86 approximately. Okay. When we look at the trend lines, what we see is that childlessness was, it was pretty much flat. If you go all the way from the 76 survey, all the way up to the 83 survey of those who were age 40 to 43, kind of flat, right? So we say, all right, yeah, not too much of a trend line there. What's been happening since that period of time? Well, obviously, you can see massive, massive increases. Now, what that means is that this increase is just now starting for those in their mid to late 70s, okay? And by the time we get to people who are in their mid 60s, that childlessness rate has doubled, okay? Why is this important? Why this is important is, number one, the dramatic difference in the propensity to include charity in an estate plan based upon childlessness. And number two, we've got, which we'll look at in a minute, a massive growth of the population in here, because this is where our baby boom is. This is how baby boomers are different. Baby boomers are different because they are much, much more likely to be childless. So the baby boom generation, when they're engaging in estate planning, and at the end of life, when they're actually engaging in estate transfers after death, these people are going to be much, much more likely to include that charitable component because of childlessness. Number one factor. Let's look at another factor. Another factor that predicts whether or not somebody has a charitable estate plan is education. Okay, so what we see here is, for example, somebody who has any graduate education, could be law school, medical school, MBA, whatever it might be, about 14%, some years up to 15%, but about 14% in general of all adults age 55 and above in this country that have graduate education, about 14% currently have a charitable will or trust. Okay, so this is not just among people who have trust documents or will documents. This is among the country as a whole. About 14% of everyone age 55 and above in the country with graduate education has a charitable will or trust. Okay. Now, if we compare that to folks, say, who don't have a high school diploma, that's around 3%, right? So maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 3%. 3% versus 14%. If we're looking at those who just have some college or are just high school grads, that's maybe around 5%. 5% versus 14% here. So here's those that do have a college degree. So if you're just a high school grad or have just some college, you're at about 5%, almost doubles if you have college degree, and much, much more of an increase if you have graduate education. Now, the reason that this connects in with demographic trends is, of course, we know what's going to be happening to the education levels of this older generation. Because we know what's been happening to the share of the population that has a college degree. This helps to explain why in some earlier studies, so this was published a few years ago, but this was an earlier study that was observing that we had this dramatic growth in charitable estate planning among those who are nearing retirement age. Okay, so what this chart is showing, this is the charitable estate planning among adults age 55 to 64. So these are younger adults, younger in this study, because this is a study of folks 50 and above. So this is just folks age 55 to 64, people nearing retirement. This was done in 96 to 2006, so we're talking baby boomers here. And notice what happens. We're seeing this boom, 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 boom. Substantial increases. And this is a national population study. These are weighted means, meaning we're projecting to the national population. And this is a study designed to project to the national population. We're seeing dramatic increases in the inclusion of a charitable component. Now, for those of you who like to dive into the data and are interested in regression and multiple regression, let me take a moment to pull a regression table from this particular study that was published back in 2009, and let me explain what's happening here. This is a simple analysis. It's just comparing what happened between 1996, when our rate was down here, and 2006, when a rate is all the way up here. Dramatic increase. What explains that? So here we're looking at a year effect, meaning we've got a positive number here. And I won't get into the interpretation of this number. It's a little tricky to interpret here, other than to say this is a positive effect, and the p-values are in brackets. This p-value says there is essentially no chance that this trend just happened randomly, right? This difference between 96 and 2006, that was not due to statistical chance. It was not due to the idea that, well, we got some weird sample here in 2006, and actually in the underlying national population, there was no difference in those years. Not true at all. We can dismiss that possibility. Okay, so we do have a real bump, a real increase that's happening from here to here, and it's not just by accident. It's not because we had a weird sample. In this next regression, what we do is we put in childlessness, right? And we put in years of education. How many years of education that the people responding to the survey had. Now notice two things here. Of course, if they were not childless, that was negative indicator. If they had any children, this is a yes/no question. Do they have any children? The answer is yes. In other words, it's 1. Then their likelihood of having a charitable plan went down. Okay, no shock there. With every year of education they had more, their likelihood of having a charitable plan went up. Now, two things to notice about what happens here. One is that this p-value on our year trend, actually it becomes statistically insignificant. What that means is that our year trend disappears when we control for childlessness and education. Okay, so what that is saying is that this trend that we see here from 96 to 2006 is explained entirely by childlessness and education. It is explained by the changes that happened in this 10-year period in the childlessness rates and the education levels of people in this age group. Okay, so again, people who were in this age group in 1996, 55 to 64, they're 10 years older here, they're no longer in this age group. Okay, so the 96 age group, 55 to 64, is completely different than the 2006 age group, 55 to 64. Because these people, even the youngest ones that were 55 in 96, they're 65 in 2006, so they're not in this group anymore. Okay, so this year-over-year trend is explained entirely by the difference in the pre-retirement age group in childlessness and education. Also, two other things to keep in mind. We already saw that there was a connection with education, but there's also this correlation where people who get more education tend to postpone childbirth, and postponing of childbirth, starting a family, oftentimes leads to childlessness. You postpone it, and then you just never get around to it, right? So these things are connected. People that get higher education are more likely to be childless, and vice versa. If you become pregnant, it makes it more difficult to get additional education. But what we see here is even if we control for whether or not they're childless, education has an additional separate positive effect on the likelihood that somebody is going to have a charitable estate plan. Okay, so it says that childlessness by itself is important, even if we control for education. Education by itself is important, even if we control for childlessness. And what it says is this trend from here to here, this trend completely disappears if you control for the changes in childlessness and education. Okay, and so consequently, this is a trend entirely explained by childlessness and education. And the big deal is to understand, if we've already seen this change, you know what's going to happen, because we know what's going to be happening with the education levels of this new older generation. We know what's going to be happening with the childlessness levels of this new generation. And we've already seen at a younger age, the pre-retirement age here, how that impacts the tendency to have a charitable estate plan. If you're interested in more details, feel free and read that full article. For those of you who are here at Texas Tech University, you might recognize, since this is a bit older, this was written when I was at University of Georgia, and Professor Lauderdale, who's still here, was already here at Texas Tech. Professor Lauderdale teaches our estate planning courses. The next positive trend that's worth looking at is the generally positive trends that we'll look at in a moment here in giving and volunteering. No surprise that giving and volunteering are important predictors of whether a person has a charitable component. Certainly, we are not surprised. This is looking at the people who are donors only. This is looking at people who are volunteers only. And if you're just one or the other, donor or volunteer, just under 10%, maybe real close to 9.8%, something of those people, and call it 9-ish%, who have will documents are including a charitable beneficiary. If they are both donors and volunteers, about 20%. Some years down to 18%. So, call it somewhere around, this is around 9%, this is around 19%. Those who are neither donors nor volunteer, we still get about 4% of them. About 4% of them who have will or trust documents are including charity. So this is a healthy indicator. No surprise there. Nobody is shocked by that. But what's interesting is when we look at the trends over time in volunteering and charitable giving among those who are age 55 and above. And here giving is defined as any amount of giving, $500 or more. Volunteering is volunteering at least 100 hours a year. And so what do we see in the trend lines here? Modestly positive trend lines. So that also suggests that we're going to be seeing more charitable estate planning taking place as this older group appears to be becoming more charitable, at least in terms of their participation rates in charity. So when we are on this topic of what's going to be coming up ahead for charitable estate planning, gifts and wills to charities, legacy gifts. We have to deal with this unfortunate reality. There was a prediction made about 20 years ago that got a lot of attention, and that was a prediction about the massive amount of dollars that were going to be dumped onto charities because of the transfer of wealth over the next 20 years. Okay, this was a prediction made in 1998 about what was going to be happening over the next 20 years. And it got a lot of press. And for those of you that are newer to the industry, you may not be familiar with this prediction. So I need to give you a sense of the magnitude of this prediction. This black line represents the charitable bequest dollars that were received on an annual basis from charities leading up to the point of this prediction, leading up until 1998 when this prediction came out. Okay, this prediction had a high estimate of the next 20 years, a middle estimate, and a low estimate. Okay, in order for charities to have hit high, middle, or low levels of that estimate over the next 20 years, these lines show the average dollars they would have had to have received from charitable bequests over that 20-year period. Okay, obviously, if you started out smaller, you would have to exceed that, and then in the end be way, way, way up here. Okay, so this was the prediction that was made that got a lot of attention, caused a lot of people to manage their organizations based upon this. By the way, this prediction was never published in any peer-reviewed journal, and when you get into the details of it, there's a reason why. So what happened? Well, this is what happened. This is since the year 2000. We've been a little bouncy, but mostly flat. This is showing inflation-adjusted dollars. So what happened? We did not quadruple. We did not go up eightfold. We did not. It's been flat, completely flat. Now, those of you that like these sort of predictions, you'll be happy to know that rather than saying the methodology was completely ridiculous and wrong and that they had an order of magnitude error, the authors simply responded by saying, oh no, we're right. This is just going to happen in 50 years after we're all dead. Yeah. Okay. Well, fine. That's what, if you're going to make predictions like this, you should always make them for 50 years in advance, when you don't have to worry about this happening, showing just how ridiculous that prediction was. So that, though, leads to the question, what's going on? Charitable bequests since the year 2000 have trended flat. We've just seen flatness. What's going on? Well, it turns out that what's going on was precisely predictable. Using standard demographic reality, we could have told very easily in 1998 that charitable bequest dollars were going to be approximately flat. Now, that kind of information does not get headlines. It does not become viral. It does not get communicated. If someone were to come out with a prediction in 1998 that precisely predicted exactly what was going to happen over the next 20 years with 100% accuracy, that prediction would not have generated any press, no media for that. But it was actually quite obvious. Let's look at some of the demographic realities that explain why this was obvious. First, you need to understand a little bit about how demographics work in terms of how death works, because we're talking about gifts that are transferred after life. One thing you need to know about the demographic reality here is that wealthy people die old. And just as an example of this, what this is showing you is, and these are just people in the health and retirement study for men and for women, this is showing you the average age at death. Let's look at this solid line first. The average age at death, depending upon how much wealth the people held. So this is the bottom 10% of wealth holders, top 10% of wealth holders. And each decile, as we go up, what do we see? We see this trend, and we're making this be a linear trend. So this is what we might call ordinary least squares, creates a linear trend. This is the trend for the average age at when people die. And it's an upward trend. Now, there are reasons why this takes place. There are actually cause relationships that go in both directions. So, for example, if you are very wealthy, you have the opportunity for unlimited access to health care. You can live in the safest places with the best air. All of those positive things are within your reach, right? But it is also the case that people who have health concerns, people who have lifetime health disabilities or disadvantages, it's harder to build wealth if you are fighting against those disadvantages. It's harder to build companies. It's harder to be successful at growing your companies, your ownership, your wealth, at getting the highest paying, most competitive jobs if you have health concerns. And so these things sort of work interactively. Wealth helps you live longer. Health helps you live longer and helps you accumulate wealth. And so that's why we see this relationship. Now, the interesting part is that not only do we see this relationship in general, but when we look only at people who have a charitable component in their estate plan, we see that these people die even older. So if we look at the linear trend among those who have who make a charitable estate transfer at death, what we see here, and that's the dotted lines, what we see here for men and for women is that those who actually transfer dollars to charity at death, they die at an older age compared to those of their same wealth category. Essentially, the reality of charitable bequest transfers is that they are highly, highly skewed to the very wealthy. Much more so than current giving dollars. Even though current giving is highly skewed to major donors, bequest charitable giving is much, much, much more skewed. The wealth distribution in this country is very highly skewed. The top 10% of wealth holders combined have the massive lion's share of all of the wealth in the country. So fundamentally, the dollars are just coming from here. Okay? That's really where the dollars are coming from. So if we're interested at when charities are going to be receiving those dollars, we're actually only interested in the top 10% of wealth holders. And because married couples tend to make their charitable donations after the death of the surviving spouse, and because the surviving spouse tends to be the female, we're actually looking at those dollars being transferred here. So we're looking at those transfers taking place at an older age. We can also take a look at this by looking at what age charitable dollars are actually transferred. This is using the health and retirement study nationally representative study of the over 50 population that's been going on for a quarter century. More than 12,000 people in that longitudinal study have since died, and we can see at what age did people actually transfer dollars to charity at death. And what we see from this, and there's different ways you can run this analysis, but ballpark 70 to 90% of charitable bequest dollars come from decedents age 80 and above. Okay, so essentially almost all of the dollars actually come from decedents in their 80s or older. So a couple different ways that you can analyze this, and the reason it's presented in two different ways here is that, as I mentioned, charitable bequest dollars are highly, highly skewed. It only takes a handful of billionaires to really throw your numbers off, right? So what we've got happening here is, in one way to analyze it, this is the actual dollars received. And you notice if we look at the actual dollars received, when we get to age 85, we've only received about 29% of the dollars. And if we look at actual dollars received when we get to age 90, we've got almost all of the dollars. That's because of a couple of very, very large gifts. Another way to analyze the data is instead to analyze the data where we limit the influence of those very large estates. And one of the ways we can do this is we can say, look, if your charitable bequest gift is over $1 million, we're just going to treat it as if it was $1 million, okay? So if you gave $50 million to charity, we're just going to call that $1 million, all right? That smooths our line out. So whether you like that or not, if you like that smoothing a little bit, then we get a bit smoother line. And so now at this point, we will have gotten about 30% of the dollars at age 80 rather than only 10% of the dollars at age 80. So that's the difference between these two numbers. If you just want to know the actual number is 90% of the dollars come from decedents at age that are age 80 and older. Okay, 90% of your dollars. That is the actual number. But some people like the smooth number. If it's the smooth number, we can pull it down to about 70%. So if you want the real number is actually 90%. 90% of the dollars, charitable bequest dollars, come from decedents age 80 and above. Now, keep that in mind when we look at this next chart. This next chart is showing the number of people who were born in the United States, going from 1914 all the way to 1982. Now, if we're interested in people in their 80s, when were those people being born? People in their 80s right now. When were they being born? They were being born during the baby bust. I know all the news and all of the talk is all about baby boomers, and so we care about baby boomers, but those aren't the people transferring the dollars to charity because they're not dead yet, and the ones that are dead weren't that wealthy, okay? The people we care about are people in their 80s. That's when the money is transferred. 90% of the dollars transferred by people in their 80s or older, okay? So demographically, what could we have known? What did we know 100% was going to be happening starting in the year 2000? What we did know is that we were going to hit this baby bust, because that's when those people were going to be hitting the 80s, and that's when the dollars are transferred, okay? Now, this is where we are now. We are at the bottom of the baby bust. What does this tell us about the actual dollars that are going to be transferred to charity over the next several decades? Well, what it tells us is this age group that actually transfers the dollars to charity at death, this age group is getting ready to do this crazy thing, okay? This thing that's going to be lasting for 10, 20, 20 plus years, okay? This is nothing but up, up, up for the next 2 decades, okay? So, again, we're at the very bottom right now. For the next 2 decades, quarter century, nothing but crazy up, up, up within this age category. So another way we can see this, and it's not as extreme because we're not actually seeing what's happening with the wealth, but notice if we just look at total deaths in the U.S., what happened to total deaths in the U.S. From 1977 right up until right about when that prediction was made back in 99, normal population growth. Boom, 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 boom. Normal population growth means we have normal growth in total deaths in the U.S., right? No surprise there. Then what happens right around, let's say right around here, year 2000-ish, what happens is we start hitting the effects of the baby bust. And so this baby bust means now all of a sudden we flatten out. Now this is flat, flat, flat on the total deaths. Now we've started back to the normal trend, and starting back in that normal trend is because we've got the leading edge of the baby boomers, the very earliest stages of this large cohort. Now, again, I sort of said it obnoxiously earlier, but there's truth underneath that. We're getting the leading edge of the baby boomers are dying, so they're moving these numbers up. But that's not the wealthy people. Wealthy people live longer. They live older. So even though our total deaths has trended back up, we haven't yet seen a trending up of the charitable bequest dollars because those charitable bequest dollars are actually transferred at an older age, right? They're transferred in, again, if we look at the actual dollars transferred from this nationally representative study, 90% of those dollars are transferred in the 80s, 90s, or older. So that's why we're actually already seeing the increase in deaths here, but these aren't the wealthy people yet. So let's look also at what's happening within the different age segment. So here we're looking at the total resident population in the U.S. by 5-year age groups. And we're looking here at the trends that were taking place from 2001 to 2016. You can just move, this works like a wave on the ocean, so you can move it forward to future years. So what do we see at the different age groups? Well, let's take, for example, what's happening with this age group, those in the early 50s. What was this thing? This was the baby boom. Baby boom coming through, up, 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 up. And then as that started to flatten off a little bit in 2016, we see that again, that baby boom coming through. If we look at the late 50s group, up, 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 up. If we look at the early 60s group, up, 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 up. If we look at the late 60s group, up, 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 up. Okay, this is what the news has all been about, right? The news has all been about the baby boomers and how they're dramatically, massively increasing these pre-retirement and early retirement age groups. What has been less talked about is if we look at some of these key age groups such as late 70s, early 80s, what did we see since the year 2000 in the first part? We saw flat, 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 right? Just the very leading edges of this wave are now starting to hit the late 70s, okay? What do we see in the early 80s? What we see in the early 80s is pretty flat, right? None of this crazy stuff taking place. A little bit of growth here. A little bit of growth here. This doesn't have to do with the baby bust. This has to do with a bit more impressive medical technology, so people living a little bit longer. So the real growth that we're seeing here is taking place at these early ages. And the flatness that we've seen has been in these key ages of late 70s and early 80s. Now, let's connect that to the ages when people do different kinds of planned giving. We've already talked about realized bequest peak age. The peak age for actually transferring dollars to charity is right around age 88. Okay, that's when the actual dollars peak that are being transferred. So again, if we look back at what's been happening, this age group pretty flat here. Modest gradual increases here, pretty flat here, pretty flat there. So let's now look at when some other things tend to peak. Charitable remainder trust creation tends to peak in the early 70s. Okay, for organizations that offer charitable gift annuities, taking those out tends to peak in the late 70s. All right, now keep this in mind that we've got charitable estate planning, charitable remainder trust, charitable gift annuity that are peaking in the early 70s, or for this vehicle in the late 70s. Now, let's take that back to the chart we were just looking at. Charitable remainder trusts are peaking in this age group. Charitable gift annuity usage peaking in this age group. What's going to be happening to this age group over the next 10 to 20 years? What's going to be happening is this wave, like a wave on the ocean, it's coming. It's actually started to hit this group already. This wave is coming, and it does nothing but get bigger, bigger, bigger. And the more medical improvements you have, the more these waves sustain at those levels as they sort of crash from left to right. So what this suggests is, for example, for charitable remainder trusts, we're already hitting that beginning of the growth period demographically. For charitable gift annuities, we're just about ready to start kind of hitting that growth period that's going to be taking place. So these population trends show us what's going to be happening. Now, if we care about the dollars actually being transferred, we're still kind of over here. Let's call it over here. So we're talking about, look, these dollars are transferred in the 80s and older. Okay. This group will be growing when this wave hits, but this wave isn't here yet. Okay. This wave is just now starting to hit. We're going to see the impact of this wave first in charitable remainder trusts, next in charitable gift annuities, and only much later will we see it in the actual charitable bequest dollars transferred. But we will see it. It is coming, and it's already started, for example, in charitable remainder trusts, and just the edge of it starting in charitable gift annuities.